One copper wire triples your harvest. Why is this science forbidden? The first anomaly appeared in Northern California in 1987. A small organic farmer named Robert Chen noticed something impossible in his tomato field. Section B, identical soil, identical seeds, identical irrigation to Section A, was producing nearly 3 times the yield. The only difference: 6 months earlier, Chen had buried old copper pipes along the perimeter to mark his property lines. He didn't think much of it at first. Coincidence, good weather. Maybe the soil had minerals he didn't know about. But the following season the pattern held, and the season after that. By year 4, Chen started talking to his neighbors. Most dismissed him. One elderly farmer named Patterson didn't. Patterson had seen something similar 40 years earlier in his father's orchard. Apple trees near an old copper lightning rod system that produced fruit twice the size of trees just 20 feet away. His father had attributed it to good luck and never investigated further. But now, hearing Chen's story, Patterson began to wonder if luck had anything to do with it. This is where the story should have accelerated, where agricultural scientists should have descended on these farms with soil tests and peer-reviewed studies, where universities should have funded research. Instead, what happened was silence. Not the absence of information, but something stranger: active disinterest. Before we go further, let me reveal what these farmers discovered, because you might want to test this yourself. The method is absurdly simple. Take standard copper wire, the kind used in basic electrical work, and bury it in shallow trenches around your growing area. Not deep, just beneath the surface, forming a loose grid or perimeter. Some farmers coil it around stakes near plant bases. Others run straight lines between rows. The wire doesn't need to be connected to anything. No electricity. No special treatment, just copper in contact with soil. What happens next defies the conventional agricultural model. Let's be clear about what this documentary isn't claiming. We're not saying copper wire is magic. We're not promising overnight miracles or revolutionary yields for everyone. What we are documenting is a pattern, a persistent, repeating phenomenon that appears across different climates, different crops, different continents, and the strange institutional response to it. By 1992, Patterson and Chen had convinced 12 other farmers in their region to experiment with copper wire. 9 reported significant yield increases. 2 saw modest improvements. 1 saw no change. These weren't controlled scientific trials, but they were careful observations by people whose livelihoods depended on understanding their land. The farmers began comparing notes. They noticed the strongest effects appeared in soils with specific characteristics: slightly acidic pH, moderate moisture content, certain mineral compositions. In alkaline soils, the results were less dramatic. In waterlogged conditions, they sometimes disappeared entirely. This suggested a mechanism, something predictable and testable. Patterson, who had taken chemistry courses decades earlier, proposed a theory. Copper ions, he suggested, were interacting with the soil microbiome, perhaps stimulating beneficial bacteria or fungi that enhanced nutrient availability. It wasn't a complete explanation, but it was a starting point. He wrote to 3 agricultural universities. None responded. Chen tried a different approach. He contacted the County Agricultural Extension Office, offering his farm as a research site. The extension agent visited once, took some notes, and said he'd pass it along to the appropriate department. Months went by. No follow-up. When Chen called back, he was told there were no current research initiatives in that area. This pattern, initial curiosity followed by institutional indifference, repeats throughout the history of copper wire agriculture. It's not active suppression in the dramatic sense. No one threatened these farmers or confiscated their copper. But there's a more subtle form of erasure, being ignored so completely that your observations never enter the official record. In 1995, a retired soil scientist named Dr. Margaret Voss heard about the California experiments through a gardening newsletter. Voss had spent 30 years studying soil chemistry for the USDA before retiring. She was intrigued. Using her own savings, she set up a small-scale trial in her backyard. 12 raised beds, 6 with buried copper wire, 6 without, all other variables controlled. Her results, documented over 3 growing seasons, showed an average yield increase of 47% in the copper wire beds. She measured higher chlorophyll levels in the leaves, stronger root systems, better resistance to common fungal infections. She wrote up her findings and submitted them to 4 academic journals specializing in agricultural science. All 4 rejected the paper, not because of methodological flaws. The reviews didn't challenge her data. The rejection letters cited limited scope, insufficient novelty, and in one case, lack of alignment with current research priorities. One reviewer wrote off the record that the results seemed too good to be true and suggested she had made measurement errors. Voss was baffled. She had spent 3 decades publishing peer-reviewed research. She understood scientific standards. Her copper wire study was more rigorous than many papers she'd seen published, but something about this particular topic triggered skepticism that her credentials couldn't overcome. She began investigating why. What she discovered was a gap in the agricultural research ecosystem, a zone of legitimate inquiry that simply wasn't being explored. There were studies on copper as a micronutrient in fertilizers, studies on copper toxicity in contaminated soils, studies on copper fungicides, but almost nothing on copper's potential catalytic role in soil systems when present in non-toxic elemental form. It wasn't that the science had been tested and rejected, it was that the science had never been seriously attempted. Meanwhile, the practice was spreading through informal networks. A farmer in Australia read about Chen's experiments in an alternative agriculture magazine. He tried copper wire in his wheat fields and reported 23% higher yields. A community garden in Vermont experimented with copper stakes around tomato plants. Their harvest doubled. An organic farmer in northern Spain buried copper around olive trees and saw increased fruit production after 2 seasons. These weren't published findings. They were stories shared at farmers' markets, in online forums, in regional agricultural newsletters that never reached mainstream attention. The knowledge grew horizontally, farmer to farmer, gardener to gardener, but never vertically into the institutions that could have validated or refuted it. By 2003, Dr. Voss had compiled reports from over 50 cultivation sites across 4 continents where copper wire had been used with reported positive effects. She included detailed descriptions of implementation methods, soil conditions, crop types, and measured outcomes. She approached a major agricultural publisher about writing a book. They declined, saying the market for fringe agricultural practices was too small. The term fringe is worth examining. In scientific discourse, fringe often means unproven and unlikely. But Voss's compilation suggested something different, not unproven, but uninvestigated. The distinction matters. One implies the idea failed scientific scrutiny. The other implies it never received any. So, what actually happens when you put copper wire in soil? The mechanism isn't fully understood, but fragments of explanation exist in scattered research. Copper ions can enhance enzyme activity in certain soil bacteria. Some studies show copper stimulates auxin production in plants, a hormone that regulates growth. Other research suggests copper improves plants' ability to absorb iron and other micronutrients. None of these effects are controversial individually. What seems to trigger resistance is the simplicity of the application and the magnitude of the reported results. The agricultural industry has invested billions in complex fertilizers, genetically modified seeds, and sophisticated irrigation systems. The idea that a few dollars worth of copper wire could significantly boost yields doesn't fit the innovation narrative that drives research funding. There's also an economic dimension. Major agricultural companies profit from inputs, products farmers must buy repeatedly, seeds that require specific fertilizers, fertilizers that work best with certain pesticides. Copper wire is a one-time purchase. Once buried, it lasts for years, potentially decades. There's no recurring revenue model. This doesn't require conspiracy. It's simply how markets work. Research follows funding. Funding follows profit potential. Ideas that don't generate ongoing revenue streams struggle to attract investment, regardless of their merit. In 2008, a graduate student in agronomy at a mid-sized university in Oregon proposed studying copper wire effects for his thesis. His advisor discouraged it, suggesting he focus on more established research areas if he wanted to be taken seriously in his career. The student switched topics. The copper research never happened. This might be the most effective form of censorship, not banning ideas but making them career-limiting. Young researchers learn quickly which topics lead to funding, publication, and advancement. Unconventional inquiries, even promising ones, become risks few can afford to take. By 2010, Chen had been using copper wire in his fields for over 20 years. His farm had become modestly famous in alternative agriculture circles. Visitors came from other states, other countries, to see his methods. He showed them his yields, his soil tests, his meticulous records. Most left convinced. Some implemented similar systems on their own land. But still, no major agricultural institution studied what he was doing. Chen died in 2015. His farm was sold to a developer. The land was cleared for housing. Whatever long-term data his soil might have provided was lost. Patterson, now in his 90s, continues to maintain his orchard. The trees near his father's old copper lightning rod system still produce more abundantly than others. He's stopped trying to convince people. The trees speak for themselves, he says, but you have to be willing to listen. Dr. Voss published her compilation privately in 2011 as a self-funded monograph. It sold a few hundred copies, mostly to organic farmers and permaculture enthusiasts. No agricultural journal ever reviewed it. The pattern persists. In 2018, a community garden project in Detroit reported exceptional yields after implementing copper wire around their raised beds. Local news covered it as a feel-good story about urban agriculture. No researchers followed up. In 2020, a farmer in Kenya shared videos online showing his maize fields before and after adding copper wire. The difference was dramatic. The videos went viral briefly in agricultural communities, but attracted no institutional attention. What makes this story remarkable isn't that copper wire might improve crop yields. What's remarkable is the systematic lack of curiosity from institutions whose entire purpose is agricultural innovation. If the method doesn't work, that could be proven. If it works only under specific conditions, those conditions could be mapped. If it works consistently, the mechanism could be understood and potentially optimized. Instead, we have a gap, a zone where empirical observations exist, but official investigation doesn't. And that gap raises uncomfortable questions. How many other simple, effective techniques have been marginalized not because they failed, but because they didn't fit existing frameworks? How many solutions to agricultural challenges have been dismissed as folk wisdom without being tested? How much knowledge has been lost because it didn't generate profit or align with career incentives? The farmers who use copper wire aren't claiming to overthrow modern agriculture. They're not rejecting science. They're doing science in its most fundamental form, observing, testing, recording results. What they're discovering is that official science doesn't always reciprocate that curiosity. There's a phrase in research methodology: absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because something hasn't been proven in a peer-reviewed journal doesn't mean it doesn't work. It might simply mean no one with institutional backing has bothered to look. The copper wire phenomenon forces us to consider what happens at the margins of accepted knowledge. Not the fringes where pseudoscience lives, but the margins where legitimate observations wait for someone to take them seriously. These margins are crowded with discarded ideas, some rightfully forgotten, but others abandoned prematurely because they inconvenienced established interests. In 2022, a group of organic farmers in France pooled resources to fund an independent study on copper wire agriculture. They hired a private laboratory to conduct soil analyses and yield measurements across 15 farms over 2 growing seasons. The preliminary results showed positive correlations between copper wire presence and crop productivity with statistical significance. They submitted their findings to agricultural journals. All rejected the paper, citing concerns about researcher bias because the farmers had funded the study themselves. This creates an impossible bind. Institutional researchers won't study the phenomenon. When farmers fund their own research, it's dismissed as biased. The method remains in limbo, not proven by official standards, but consistently reported as effective by those who use it. Perhaps the most telling detail is how the agricultural industry responds when directly asked about copper wire. Most major companies don't deny it might work. They simply say there's insufficient research to make recommendations, which is true. But it's also a self-fulfilling statement. There's insufficient research because no one is funding the research. A Monsanto spokesperson, when questioned at an agricultural conference in 2019, said, "We focus our research on technologies that can be scaled and patented. Individual farmers are free to experiment with whatever methods they choose." The message was clear. If it can't be owned, it won't be studied. This brings us back to where we started, with Robert Chen's tomato field and the anomaly that no one wanted to investigate. Chen didn't discover copper wire agriculture. Farmers have noticed relationships between copper and plant growth for over a century. What's new is our ability to measure and document these effects precisely. What's old is the institutional resistance to pursuing them. The question isn't whether copper wire triples your harvest. That claim is too broad, too absolute. The real questions are, does copper in soil create conditions that enhance plant growth? Under what circumstances? Through what mechanisms? And why, after decades of farmer reports, don't we have definitive answers? The lack of answers isn't scientific. It's structural. It reveals how research priorities are set, how knowledge becomes validated, and what happens to observations that don't serve established interests. It shows us that forbidden science doesn't require active suppression. Sometimes all it takes is collective indifference. If you're watching this and you've tried copper wire in your own growing space, document your results, measure carefully, take photos, record your methods, share your observations. The data exists in thousands of gardens and farms scattered across the world. It's just never been gathered in one place by someone with the institutional authority to make it matter. And maybe that's the point. Maybe copper wire agriculture will remain forever in the margins, passed between growers like folk knowledge, never quite proven, never quite forgotten. Or maybe someone watching this will be the researcher who finally asks the questions that institutions have been avoiding. Until then, the copper wire stays buried in soil and in the vast archive of ideas agriculture chose not to pursue. If this story made you think differently about what counts as knowledge, about what deserves investigation, consider subscribing to this channel. We explore the margins where conventional wisdom ends and uncomfortable questions begin. More stories like this are coming, stories about simple solutions that got complicated by the systems meant to study them. Hit that subscribe button, because sometimes the most important science is the kind that doesn't get done.